I still remember that night, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you but stings like guilt. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sound of her laughter from the living room drifting faintly through the half-closed door. It was October 2021, a cold Thursday evening in Boston, and I was sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the packed suitcase that I'd been pretending not to own for weeks. Every zipper sound, every folded shirt, felt like a betrayal I hadn't yet committed. If you'd told me 10 years ago that I'd be the one walking away, not in anger, but in quiet, deliberate finality, I'd have laughed. I used to think leaving was something other people did. Not me. Not us. But then again, you never really know when a slow rot begins until you start smelling the decay in everything you once loved. Her name was Samantha Hayes, and she was the kind of woman who could make a room fall silent just by walking in. The first time I saw her, it was 2012, at a coffee shop near Harvard Square. I was working part-time as a copy editor for a small publishing house, still nursing the dream of becoming a novelist someday. She was an art student with paint on her jeans and that careless confidence of someone who'd never had to prove anything. She asked if she could borrow my charger, and I ended up staying 3 hours longer than I planned, watching her sketch people who didn't know they were being immortalized. Those early years were beautiful in the way that first love always is. We'd bike along the Charles River, talk about how we'd travel the world once we figured it all out. Back then, the world felt enormous, and the two of us, tiny, ambitious, inseparable, thought we could bend it to our will. We got married in June 2016, a small ceremony at her parents' place in Vermont. Her dad built the wooden arch we stood under, and I remember thinking how perfect everything looked, how calm her eyes were when she promised me forever. I meant it when I said the same. I think she did too, at least at the time. Life settled into its quiet rhythm. We moved into a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, the kind of place with creaky floors and a window view of the streetlights outside. I started writing freelance full-time, taking gigs that paid the bills but starved the soul. Samantha, meanwhile, became an art teacher at a local school. She loved her job, maybe too much, because it was around then that she began drifting away, bit by bit, like a painting fading under too much sunlight. At first, it was little things. Late nights at school exhibitions. Forgotten texts. A phone that always seemed to be face down. I told myself I was imagining it, that she was just busy, or tired, or maybe I was just being insecure. But you can always feel it when someone's affection changes temperature. Love doesn't vanish in an instant. It cools, molecule by molecule, until one day, you reach for warmth and find nothing but air. By 2019, the distance had turned into silence. I'd wake up early, make coffee for both of us, and leave hers by her side of the bed, still steaming, untouched when I got home. She started spending weekends with friends from work, and I stopped asking who they were because I didn't want to sound jealous. I told myself we were just growing up, that all couples go through dull phases. But deep down, I knew we weren't growing. We were decaying, politely and quietly. Then came the pandemic, 2020. The year when everything stopped except the things you didn't want to face. Suddenly, there were no exhibitions, no school trips, no late-night hangouts. Just the two of us, locked inside an apartment that had become too small for our silence. I thought maybe that forced closeness would bring us back together. For the first few weeks, it did. We cooked dinner together, binged shows, talked late into the night like we used to. I let myself believe we were healing. But the moment the world started reopening, she snapped right back into that other version of herself, distracted, distant, secretive. It was one afternoon in late August 2020 when I found the first undeniable sign. I'd been cleaning the living room while she was at the store, and her iPad pinged with a message. I didn't mean to look. It was just there, a preview that read, "I can't stop thinking about last night." My stomach turned cold. I remember staring at that glowing screen, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to believe it was innocent, some inside joke or misunderstanding. But when I opened the full message thread, the truth hit me like a physical blow. There it was, weeks, maybe months, of messages with a man named Evan. Compliments, secret meetups, photos. The worst part wasn't even the words, it was how easily she'd moved on inside them. There was laughter, casual affection, a kind of comfort that should have belonged to us. I felt sick. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the device. But what hurt the most was realizing that the woman I'd loved for nearly a decade had built an entirely separate life right under my nose. When she came home that evening, I didn't confront her. I watched her put away groceries, humming to herself, like nothing was wrong. And in that moment, I felt something inside me die quietly. Not rage, not sorrow, just this numb understanding that love, once broken, never really fits the same way again. I tried to hold on, though. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a one-time thing, that maybe people make mistakes. But as weeks passed, the cracks only deepened. She started hiding her phone, deleting messages, acting defensive whenever I asked simple questions. By early 2021, I was living like a ghost in my own home. We barely spoke except about bills or chores. She slept on the couch most nights, claiming back pain. I buried myself in work, editing, ghostwriting, doing anything to avoid thinking about her. But there's something about betrayal, it doesn't just sit quietly in the background. It eats away at your sense of reality. You start second-guessing everything, every memory, every promise, every "I love you" you ever believed. One night, around February, I found myself scrolling through old photos of us on Facebook. That trip to Portland, our anniversary dinner, her laughing while holding a paintbrush. I studied each picture, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when her love for me started to fade. I couldn't find it. Maybe it had been gradual, maybe it was never as deep as I thought. But what I did know for certain was that I couldn't keep living like this. Still, I didn't leave. I told myself I needed closure, some clear justification, something I could hold up to the mirror and say, "This is why I walked away." That closure came unexpectedly, in April. She left her laptop open on the kitchen table, and curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the best of me again. There was an email thread with a travel agent. She was planning a weekend art retreat in Nantucket, same weekend she'd told me she was visiting her mother. I clicked open the attached booking confirmation. 2 tickets. Her name and his, Evan Thompson. That's when the last illusion shattered. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a phase. It was a decision. That night, I sat in the dark living room, staring at the faint reflection of city lights on the window glass, and I made my own decision. If she could so easily plan a life that didn't include me, I could learn to live one without her. But I wasn't going to leave empty-handed. See, the thing about being quiet for so long is that people stop noticing you. She'd forgotten that I managed all our finances, that the house lease, the savings, the joint investments, everything, ran through accounts I handled. I never abused that trust, but now, sitting there with betrayal burning through me like acid, I realized I didn't owe her my restraint anymore. Over the next few weeks, I started planning. Not in anger, not for revenge, at least that's what I told myself, but for survival. I moved money, one small transfer at a time, into a separate account she didn't know existed. I contacted my old friend Marcus in New York, who had an extra room in his apartment. I started shipping a few personal things there under the guise of donating books. It was slow, careful, almost methodical. Each small step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that she'd stolen without asking. By late September, everything was ready. I had enough saved to start over. I'd found a new job in New York, an editorial role that would finally let me write again. I even found a small apartment in Brooklyn, nothing fancy, but mine. All that was left was to choose the day. I remember looking at her that final week, the way she still moved around the house like she owned every inch of it, like I was just part of the furniture she'd grown bored of. She didn't notice the changes. She didn't notice that my things were slowly disappearing. She didn't notice me, not really. And that's when I realized, she didn't think I'd ever leave. She thought she could betray me, belittle me, ignore me, and I'd still be there, waiting, loyal as ever. But she was wrong. The night before I left, October 14th, 2021, I stood in our bedroom one last time. The suitcase was packed, the keys on the dresser. Outside, the wind howled through the Boston streets, carrying that early hint of winter. She was asleep on the couch, her phone glowing faintly beside her, probably another message she'd read first thing in the morning. I looked around that room, the framed wedding photo, the unmade bed, the half-finished canvas leaning against the wall, and I felt something like peace for the first time in years. The next morning, before the sun rose, I walked out. No note. No explanation. No goodbye. Just silence. I disappeared overnight, and took everything with me. When I woke up that morning, the city was still half asleep. The streets were quiet, the kind of eerie calm that only exists between night and dawn, before the coffee shops open, before the rush of footsteps begins. I'd already made up my mind. There was no turning back, no one left to convince, no apology to make. My suitcase was by the door, my wallet and documents in the inside pocket of my jacket, and my phone. Well, I decided I'd leave that behind too. I didn't want her to trace me, didn't want the temptation to read whatever message she'd eventually send when she realized what I'd done. I remember standing in the kitchen for a moment, looking at that chipped mug she always used. The one with the faded blue paint that said, "Good things take time." I almost laughed, not out of humor, but irony. That mug had seen all our years together, the good and the awful. I set it in the sink, next to her empty wine glass from the night before, and walked out. The early morning air hit me like a slap. Cold, biting, but somehow cleansing. My Uber driver barely said a word. I watched the city fade behind me as we crossed the bridge, sunlight beginning to spill through the fog. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but there were no tears left in me. Just a strange, hollow quietness, the kind that follows after you've lost something you didn't know you were still holding on to. When the plane took off, I felt a small surge of panic. That's the thing about running, even when it's the right choice, it feels like jumping off a cliff without knowing where you'll land. Boston disappeared beneath the clouds, and with it, the life I'd built for almost a decade. I landed in New York around 9 a.m. Marcus picked me up from LaGuardia in his old silver Toyota that smelled faintly of coffee and fast food. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at me, saw whatever expression was on my face, and said, "You look like hell, man." I laughed for the first time in months. Marcus had been my closest friend since college, the kind of guy who didn't pry, didn't judge. He gave me his spare key, told me to crash as long as I needed. His apartment in Brooklyn was small but warm, cluttered with books and old records. It wasn't home, but it was safety. For the first few days, I didn't do much. I'd wake up late, drink coffee, stare out the window at the street below. Brooklyn had this raw energy, this restless pulse that made me feel alive again, or at least reminded me that the world was still moving. I'd walk aimlessly, through Prospect Park, down Atlantic Avenue, into bookstores and coffee shops just to be around people who didn't know me. It's strange, you know, how quickly you can vanish from someone's life. A week passed, then 2, and I didn't hear a word. No calls, no texts. I wondered if she even noticed. Maybe she was relieved. Maybe she was with him. That thought should have broken me, but it didn't. It just confirmed what I already knew, that she'd stopped caring long before I left. By the end of October, I'd started at my new job. The company was small, an independent publishing firm based in Manhattan. My boss, Claire, was one of those sharp, intuitive people who could tell I was running from something but didn't push. She gave me space, and I threw myself into work. Editing manuscripts, reading submissions late into the night, it felt good to lose myself in words again, to rebuild some kind of identity. But even as my days filled up, the nights were harder. Sleep didn't come easily. I'd lie awake in that small room, the sounds of the city outside, sirens, laughter, distant music, bleeding into my thoughts. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, forgetting it wasn't there. I'd think about her, not in anger, but confusion. How could someone who once loved you so completely become a stranger you couldn't even recognize? Then, one night in November, I got an email. It was from a mutual friend, Elena, one of her co-workers. She didn't write much. Just a single line that read, "She's been looking for you. Says she came home and everything was gone." For a moment, I froze. My heart thudded painfully. I didn't reply. I didn't want to know more. But the image formed anyway, Samantha standing in the doorway of our apartment, staring at the empty spaces where my things used to be. Maybe she cried. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she just called Evan. I thought that message would shake me, but instead, it gave me a strange sense of relief. She knew I was gone. She finally understood that I wasn't her safety net anymore. Over the next few weeks, I started piecing together what little remained of myself. I reconnected with old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I signed up for a gym membership, started cooking again. It sounds mundane, But after living in emotional fog for so long, even small routines felt like victories. But healing isn't a straight line. Some nights, the loneliness hit harder than expected. I'd find myself scrolling through her old Instagram page from a dummy account, just to see if she'd posted anything. For the longest time, there was nothing. Then one evening in late December, I saw it, a photo of her standing on a pier, wind in her hair, smiling. The caption said, "New beginnings." Evan was in the background, barely visible but unmistakable. That one hurt. Not because I wanted her back. God, no, but because it made me realize that she'd already moved on while I was still learning how to exist without her. It was New Year's Eve, 2021, when everything finally hit me all at once. Marcus was out at a party, and I'd stayed home, not in the mood to celebrate. I sat by the window, watching fireworks explode over the city skyline, and suddenly all the weight of the past year came crashing down. The betrayal, the silence, the leaving, it all felt like a blur. For the first time since leaving, I cried. Not quietly, not a few tears, but the kind of ugly, shaking sobs that come from somewhere deep, primal. I cried for the man I used to be, the life I'd built, the love I'd lost. But mostly, I cried for the version of myself that had stayed too long, hoping for something that was never coming back. After that night, something inside me changed. I stopped checking her social media. I stopped replaying old memories. I realized that running away physically wasn't enough. I had to leave her behind emotionally too. But life, of course, doesn't let you move on without testing you. In February 2022, I got another message, this time directly from her. She must have found my new email somehow. The subject line was just my name, Daniel. The body of the message was long. She wrote that she'd been shocked, hurt, that she didn't understand why I'd left like that. She said she missed me, that things hadn't been the same. She mentioned Evan only briefly, said it was a mistake, that things got complicated. She wanted to talk, to explain. I read that email over and over, trying to decide how to feel. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely. Another part, the one still haunted by what-ifs, wanted to reply, to hear her out. Closure is a tricky thing. You think you found it, but it keeps changing shape. After a few days, I responded. Short, cold, factual. I told her I knew everything. That I'd seen the messages, the tickets, the photos. That I didn't leave to hurt her, I left to save myself. She replied within minutes, this time with desperation between the lines. She said she'd been lost, that the affair had meant nothing, that she'd panicked and ruined everything good we had. She said she still loved me. Reading those words felt like reopening a wound that had barely started to scab. For a brief second, I wanted to believe her. That maybe there was still something left to salvage. But the longer I stared at that screen, the more I realized it wasn't love speaking, it was guilt. So I didn't reply again. I let the silence answer for me. Weeks passed, then months. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she and Evan didn't last long. Apparently, he'd moved out in early spring. Maybe she thought losing him would make me come back. Maybe she didn't. Either way, I didn't care. By summer 2022, I'd fully built a new routine. My writing career was finally taking off. I'd even started working on my own novel, something I hadn't done in years. The book was about a man who disappears after heartbreak, and though I told everyone it was fiction, every line bled with truth. Still, sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd think about her. Not with anger, just this distant curiosity. Where she was. Whether she still taught. Whether she ever thought of me. And every time, I'd remind myself, it doesn't matter. But then, one afternoon that August, as I was leaving the office, I saw her. It was near Bryant Park. She was standing by a food cart, hair shorter, wearing sunglasses. For a split second, our eyes met. I froze. She looked startled too, like she'd seen a ghost. We didn't speak. She didn't even try to approach me. She just stood there, clutching her coffee cup, watching as I turned and walked away. And as I did, I realized something I hadn't understood until that moment. Leaving her wasn't the breaking point. This was. Because for the first time, seeing her didn't hurt. It didn't stir anger or longing. It just confirmed that she was a part of my past, and I'd finally stepped out of it. That night, I went home and opened the file for my novel again. I renamed it, The Man Who Disappeared Overnight. It felt fitting. But I didn't know then that fate wasn't done with me, or her, just yet. Because sometimes, when you think you've escaped the past, it finds its way back to you in ways you'd never expect. And when it did, it changed everything, again. After that chance encounter in Bryant Park, I thought I had closed the book completely. I thought I had walked far enough, fast enough, and with enough distance to be safe from the remnants of her life, from the remnants of us. But life, I learned, has a way of reminding you that distance doesn't erase history, it only delays reckoning. The days after that sighting, the city felt heavier. I could feel her presence in subtle ways, the way shadows seem longer when you know someone is behind you, the faint echo of footsteps in familiar streets. I didn't see her again, but her absence had weight. And sometimes absence can be more suffocating than presence because it forces reflection in ways you're not ready for. I tried to throw myself into work, and for the first few weeks, it helped. I edited manuscripts late into the night, drowned myself in words and deadlines. Each story I touched felt like a lifeline, tethering me to the world beyond my own spiraling thoughts. But slowly, cracks began to appear. Anxiety crept in during quiet moments. My sleep was erratic, sometimes a few hours, sometimes none at all. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamt of her. Scenes played over and over, like a film I couldn't stop, each version more humiliating than the last. Her laughing with him in our apartment, Evan's hands brushing hers, her face turning toward me with that same innocent smile that had once made me believe in forever. I started isolating myself even from Marcus, the one friend I trusted completely. I didn't tell him the depth of my unrest because I didn't want to admit I was still vulnerable. I didn't want to acknowledge that part of me that, despite everything, still felt shattered by her betrayal. The emotional fallout seeped into other parts of life too. My writing, once a sanctuary, became obsessive. I poured my grief and anger into stories that were dark, raw, sometimes cruel. Publishers were impressed by the intensity, but I often lost myself in the process, staying up for days at a time, skipping meals, losing track of time. I began to feel like a ghost, a man out of sync with the world, carrying an invisible weight that no one else could see. And then came the unexpected blow. One rainy afternoon, I received a legal notice. My heart sank immediately, the words blurring in the downpour that had begun outside my window. Samantha had filed for something I hadn't even anticipated, claims on joint investments, asking for a portion of the money I had quietly moved to my own accounts. I remember gripping the paper so hard my knuckles turned white, staring at the bold letters, the paragraphs filled with legalese that promised battles I didn't want to fight. I'd known she could be vindictive, but I hadn't anticipated this level of retaliation. I contacted my lawyer immediately, trying to explain everything, the betrayal, the affair, the months of planning, the fact that I had acted in self-preservation. The lawyer listened, nodding, but I could feel the doubt in his eyes. The law didn't care about betrayal or heartbreak. It only cared about contracts, signatures, and who could prove what. Court dates were set. The entire process dragged on for months. Every hearing forced me to relive the worst moments, the discovery of her affair, the long nights of silent suffering, the endless calculations as I moved funds to protect myself. Samantha, of course, portrayed herself as the victim. She painted me as cold, unfeeling, as if abandoning her overnight was a crime worse than betrayal itself. The fallout wasn't just legal. Friends and acquaintances took sides, some out of loyalty, others out of ignorance. Mutual friends began contacting me cautiously, almost apologetically, asking questions that were clearly rehearsed. I hated the idea of gossip reaching ears I cared about, but it didn't matter anymore. Reputation is fragile, and hers was just as selective as mine in the story it told. At work, I felt the subtle shifts too. Some clients who knew about my personal life treated me differently, either with pity or thinly veiled judgment. The loneliness grew heavier. I'd come home, exhausted from court sessions or work, and stare at the walls of Marcus's apartment as if they were closing in. I had escaped physically, but emotionally, I was still trapped. Then there was my health. I hadn't realized how much stress had been eating away at me until one evening in March 2022, when I collapsed in the middle of editing a manuscript. It was a mild panic attack, my body shaking uncontrollably, my heart pounding, vision blurred. Marcus found me slumped on the floor and held me while I cried like I hadn't in months. He didn't ask why. He just let me unravel. That night, I realized that I couldn't handle this alone, that running away hadn't solved everything, it had just shifted the battlefield. Part of me wanted revenge. Not in a cinematic, dramatic sense, though I admit the thought crossed my mind, but in small, satisfying ways that might restore my sense of agency. I started keeping meticulous records of everything: emails, messages, transfers, documents that proved my side of the story. I compiled them into a digital archive that became almost a ritual. The act of collecting proof, of cataloging evidence, gave me a strange comfort, a sense that I was reclaiming control in a world that had spun so far out of orbit. At the same time, I was forced to confront a bitter truth. Life after betrayal is lonely, even if you walk away first. Nights were quiet, too quiet, and I would often find myself pacing Marcus's apartment, replaying conversations in my head. What if I had left sooner? What if I had confronted her the moment I saw the first messages? What if I had been stronger, better, more attentive? The questions were endless and exhausting, but they were also unavoidable. By summer 2022, the court proceedings had escalated. Samantha's lawyer tried to paint me as manipulative, someone who had acted with premeditation, taking advantage of her absence. My lawyer fought back, emphasizing my right to financial independence and the emotional abuse I had endured. Each session was emotionally draining. I found myself reliving memories I'd worked so hard to bury, the afternoons I spent alone while she taught, the nights I spent wondering if the person I loved even existed anymore, the small betrayals that had piled into an avalanche I could no longer contain. The emotional toll hit its peak one day in July. I had just returned from court and collapsed on the sofa, exhausted in body and spirit. Marcus handed me a beer, and I stared out the window at the Brooklyn skyline, lights shimmering over the East River. I thought about the apartment I'd left behind, the life that had been mine for nearly a decade, and the realization struck me: leaving had been necessary, but it hadn't been enough. I had escaped the environment, but the emotional consequences followed me like a shadow, relentless and unyielding. Then came the moments that fractured me even further. Random encounters in the streets, acquaintances who would innocently ask about Samantha, people who didn't know the history, who only saw two familiar faces and assumed we were fine. I had to force smiles, nod politely, and walk away, all the while feeling my chest tighten with a mix of grief, anger, and residual love that I hated myself for still feeling. The mental strain began to manifest in strange ways. I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, convinced I heard her footsteps outside my apartment. I started having vivid dreams in which she confronted me, where she accused me of abandoning her, where her laughter echoed like a taunt I couldn't escape. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every text notification, every sudden movement in my peripheral vision. Yet amid the chaos, small victories began to appear. I started writing more intentionally, not just to escape, but to reclaim my identity. I joined a local writer's workshop, began connecting with people who had no knowledge of my past life, people whose opinions didn't carry the weight of history. Slowly, imperceptibly, I started to feel the first glimmers of autonomy, of someone who could exist independently, without being defined by another person's betrayal. By late 2022, the court case had reached a temporary resolution. We settled financially, not generously, but fairly, according to my lawyer. It wasn't victory, exactly, but it was closure in a bureaucratic sense. The real battle, however, was internal. The fallout had changed me. I was no longer the man who quietly tolerated betrayal, who hoped love could be coaxed back with patience. That man had disappeared along with my old life. I realized then that leaving Samantha had not been the end of the struggle. It had only been the first act. The true challenge was rebuilding, redefining, and learning to exist in a world where trust and love had been so violently fractured. Every relationship afterward, every friendship, every fleeting romantic connection carried the weight of my past, the ghost of betrayal always whispering in the background. And still, there were moments of clarity, of sharp insight. I began to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, how small signs of disinterest and disregard, when ignored, grow into monumental betrayals, how patience can be both a virtue and a trap, how the very people you think you know can change in ways you never anticipate. The fallout was complete, not just legal, not just social, not just emotional, but existential. I had been forced to confront the fact that the person I had been, the life I had built, the love I had trusted implicitly, had all been illusions in one way or another. And out of that destruction, a new version of myself began to emerge, raw and unpolished, shaped by betrayal and survival. The breaking point was no longer a single moment, but a prolonged period of reckoning. It was in the sleepless nights, the courtrooms, the silent apartments, the haunted dreams, the forced interactions, and the painstaking effort to reclaim identity. Every moment was a brick in the wall between who I was and who I needed to become. By the end of 2022, I understood something crucial. The fallout would not define me, but it would instruct me. It had stripped away illusions, exposed the depth of my resilience, and forced me to confront the darkest aspects of love and loss. And somewhere in that pain, in that relentless emotional storm, I began to recognize the first stirrings of empowerment. I was still hurting. I was still recovering. But I was no longer lost. And it was from this shattered place that the next chapter began, the chapter where I would turn the tables, where I would reclaim agency not through vengeance, but through deliberate, thoughtful action. By the beginning of 2023, I had begun to feel a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The chaos of betrayal and the emotional fallout had forged something in me, not anger, exactly, but a steely awareness. I knew now that life was not about passively enduring pain or hoping someone else would change. It was about reclaiming control, defining your own boundaries, and acting decisively when others violate your trust. The idea of turning the tables started small, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was about minor acts of agency, reclaiming what had been lost, establishing independence, proving to myself that I could exist without her or anyone else who had hurt me. I started by reorganizing my finances fully, creating accounts she would never know about, and ensuring that my hard-earned money would be mine alone. It felt empowering to no longer be invisible in the financial decisions that defined my life. I also began documenting everything, not in a vengeful way, but in a practical one. I compiled emails, text messages, and even social media interactions, creating a record that showed the full extent of her betrayal. It was almost therapeutic, the act of putting these fragments of deceit into a tangible, undeniable form. I could see the pattern laid out clearly, and that clarity gave me confidence. Knowledge, I realized, was its own kind of power. Beyond logistics, I started reshaping my personal life. I moved into a larger apartment in Brooklyn, one with sunlight streaming through big windows and a view of the East River. I decorated it with art and furniture I had always wanted but never bought because I had been living in the shadow of her presence. Every item I added was a statement. This was mine, and I had the right to create a space that reflected me. Work became a centerpiece of my transformation. By now, my novel was well underway, and I had started receiving recognition for my freelance work. I immersed myself in writing projects that required focus and creativity, channeling every lingering fragment of betrayal and heartbreak into my work. Editing manuscripts, constructing worlds and characters, I discovered an almost intoxicating sense of control, the ability to craft narratives, to give order to chaos. And yet, there was an itch beneath the surface, a desire for a more tangible form of justice, a sense that she needed to recognize the consequences of her actions in a way that words and distance could not convey. I wrestled with this for weeks, aware of the moral line I didn't want to cross, aware that revenge could easily consume me. But I realized that empowerment didn't have to mean cruelty. It meant using foresight, intelligence, and patience to reclaim the upper hand in my life. The opportunity presented itself subtly. I learned, through mutual acquaintances and social media, that Samantha's life had become a mirror of what she had left behind. She had moved back into Boston, taken a higher-paying teaching job, and was flaunting the image of happiness she assumed she had regained. She even bought a car she knew I had admired, almost as if to rub it in. But she didn't know the real story, that while she was performing a version of her best life, I had quietly built mine on my terms, free of the constraints and manipulations that had defined our marriage. I decided to take the first step in asserting that reality. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about visibility. I started posting publicly, carefully curated updates on social media about my life, my work, my achievements. It wasn't gloating, it was simply me existing fully and unapologetically. Friends and colleagues responded, commenting and messaging me with admiration and support. The contrast, subtle though it was, created a quiet ripple. People who had known both of us began to see that I was thriving, independent, and unbroken. As months passed, I became bolder. I initiated networking opportunities in Boston under professional pretenses, attending art shows and literary events. I ran into people who had known her, who assumed she was still in control of our shared narrative. I smiled politely, spoke eloquently, and let my accomplishments speak for themselves. The message was unmistakable. I had not only survived but had flourished in the aftermath of betrayal. One afternoon, at a small gallery opening in downtown Boston, I saw her. She didn't recognize me immediately, or at least, she didn't acknowledge me. That initial shock when our eyes met was brief but electric. I felt a pang of old emotions, a mixture of recognition, nostalgia, and vindication, but I didn't let it show. I didn't approach her, didn't confront her. I simply existed in that space with confidence, allowing my presence to tell the story she had tried to erase. It was after that encounter I realized the true power of subtlety. There was no need for dramatics, no need for exposure or revenge in the traditional sense. The strongest statement was living well, authentically, and without her influence in any sphere of my life. She could see it, yes, perhaps even feel it, but she couldn't touch it, couldn't undo it, and couldn't reclaim the life she had abandoned. The next significant step in my transformation was personal growth beyond the professional sphere. I began training in martial arts, not for violence but for discipline and mental clarity. Each class, each session, became a metaphor: controlled aggression, measured force, balance, and composure. I was learning to reclaim not just my life but my sense of self-respect and resilience. In parallel, I built new friendships, relationships that were honest and transparent. I was selective, cautious, aware of my vulnerability, but willing to let people into my life in ways I had never done before. Through these connections, I learned how to rebuild trust gradually, without surrendering my autonomy. It wasn't long before the final act of turning the tables presented itself, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet reckoning. I had learned through mutual contacts that Samantha had made another attempt at rebuilding her personal life. A new relationship, she claimed, more serious this time. But the pattern was familiar, and I realized it was an echo of the past, the careless assumption that I would remain stagnant, trapped in resentment or sorrow. I sent her a letter, not an angry email, not a dramatic text, but a formal, concise, and unemotional communication. It detailed the legal resolutions, affirmed my independence, and outlined that I would no longer respond to personal inquiries or attempts at reconciliation. There was no accusation, no melodrama, only clarity, finality, and an unmistakable assertion that my life was mine to live, without interference or expectation. Sending that letter was cathartic. It was the first time I fully felt the weight of autonomy settle in my chest. It wasn't about humiliating her, although, to be honest, I knew it would hit harder than any public spectacle. It was about asserting my boundaries and reclaiming my narrative. By spring 2023, everything had shifted. I had secured a promotion at work, my novel was nearing completion, and I had established a life rooted in independence and self-determination. I even took a trip to Vermont, not to revisit old haunts with Samantha, but to see the mountains where we had married, now through my own eyes. The scenery was unchanged, but my perspective was irrevocably different. I was no longer a participant in the story of her life. I was the author of my own. The emotional transformation was complete. I was no longer defined by betrayal, by her decisions, by the ghosts of a life that had been stolen. I had taken control, not through rage, but through foresight, patience, and deliberate action. Every choice I made reinforced the truth I had learned. Empowerment isn't about retaliation, it's about reclaiming your space, your identity, and your voice. And yet, I couldn't deny the irony. Turning the tables had required patience, strategy, and emotional resilience, things I had never imagined I could summon when I was first reeling from betrayal. I had become someone stronger, more self-aware, more in control. And in the quiet moments of reflection, I recognized that she had underestimated me entirely. The person she thought she could manipulate and discard had quietly rewritten the rules of our shared story. The final piece of turning the tables was psychological. I stopped checking for signs of her life, stopped wondering about her happiness, stopped letting her existence shadow my decisions. I had achieved a rare equilibrium, a life that thrived not because I was free from memory, but because I had mastered my reaction to it. The ghost of her presence no longer haunted me. It existed only as a marker of what I had overcome. In practical terms, I continued to fortify my independence. I diversified investments, expanded my professional network, and built a support system that didn't include her. Emotionally, I allowed myself to explore new connections, new experiences, without fear of betrayal. And in every interaction, every choice, I carried the quiet satisfaction that came from reclaiming agency. By mid-2023, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The pain, the heartbreak, the emotional wreckage that had once defined my existence had been transformed into fuel for personal growth. The tables had turned not in a public spectacle of vengeance, but in the subtle, unassailable victory of living fully on my own terms. And in that subtle triumph, I realized something vital. The true measure of reclaiming power isn't in punishing the one who wronged you. It's in building a life so complete, so autonomous, that their actions and their memory no longer have the ability to wound you. I had achieved that. But as I settled into this new chapter, I knew the resolution was not just about personal victories. It was about understanding that closure isn't an event, it's a process. And sometimes, the final act of empowerment is simply to exist authentically, unapologetically, and unshakably, in a life you've painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. By late 2023, I had become someone entirely different from the man who had left Boston in a blur of heartbreak, betrayal, and uncertainty. The years of emotional turmoil, legal battles, sleepless nights, and quiet strategizing had reshaped me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, quietly, deliberately, and fully. It started with the smallest things, the markers of independence that I had once taken for granted. My apartment, now my sanctuary, reflected me entirely. The walls were lined with books I loved, art I had chosen for myself, and photographs from places I had visited alone, without anyone else's shadow lingering in the frame. The sunlight streaming through the east-facing windows in the morning had become a kind of ritual. I'd stand there with my coffee, watching the city come alive, and allow myself to feel the quiet satisfaction of being the master of my own life. I had also reached a point where my career and personal ambitions could coexist without compromise. My novel, The Man Who Disappeared Overnight, was finished and accepted by a small but respected publisher. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal, a work born out of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately, resilience. I knew some people would read it and immediately recognize pieces of our story. That didn't bother me. I was no longer living in fear of judgment or the need for approval. It was the truth, and the truth was liberating. The public recognition I received was gratifying but secondary. The real triumph was the internal shift. I had learned to trust myself again, to make decisions with clarity instead of fear, and to allow my emotional intelligence to guide me rather than my pain. I had reclaimed my life in ways that were subtle but profound. I no longer checked her social media obsessively, no longer wondered about her relationships, no longer let the memory of her influence my choices. Then came the most unexpected, almost surreal moment of closure. One crisp morning in October, I received an email from Samantha herself. I froze when I saw her name in my inbox, the familiar digital signature sending a strange pang through me. For a moment, I considered deleting it without reading, as I had countless times before. But something stopped me, a mix of curiosity and a quiet understanding that the universe had a way of bringing things full circle. The email was short. She apologized, not with the desperate tones of past messages, but with something measured, almost resigned. She acknowledged her mistakes, the pain she had caused, and admitted that she had underestimated the consequences of her actions. She said she hoped I had found peace, and she expressed no expectation of a reply. I stared at the screen for a long time. No triumph, no satisfaction in seeing her humbled, just an odd sense of closure. I realized in that moment that I didn't need to reply. I didn't need her acknowledgement. Her recognition was irrelevant to my life because I had already moved beyond needing it. It struck me how ironic life could be. The person who had once felt like the center of my universe had become a footnote, a chapter, a lesson that had propelled me toward something better. I had turned the tables in ways that were profound, even if invisible to the world. I wasn't flaunting wealth, success, or status. I was flaunting something subtler and far more powerful, my self-respect and my ability to live fully without dependence on someone who had betrayed me. With that clarity came a new kind of peace. I allowed myself to embrace the joy I had long denied. I traveled more intentionally, exploring places I had always dreamed of seeing, a week in the Scottish Highlands in the fall, a quiet month in Vermont's mountains, a short stay in Paris, wandering streets without purpose other than to exist fully in the present. Each trip was a statement, a reclaiming of time and freedom that had once been constrained by heartbreak. I also started giving back in small ways. I mentored younger writers, sharing not only technical advice but also the emotional resilience required to navigate personal setbacks. I became a resource for people struggling with betrayal and loss, not because I had all the answers, but because I had lived the reality of falling apart and rebuilding stronger. Helping others became another form of closure, a way to transform pain into guidance and resentment into empathy. Romance, once a fraught territory, returned slowly. I didn't rush into relationships or seek validation from others. Instead, I explored companionship with careful intention, meeting people who aligned with my values, who respected boundaries, and who encouraged growth rather than dependence. One evening, over coffee in a small Brooklyn cafe, I realized that the thrill of new connection felt different now. It wasn't about filling a void left by someone else, but about genuinely sharing life with someone capable of mutual respect. Even professional victories brought satisfaction of a quiet, profound kind. My freelance editing and consulting work expanded, not through aggressive networking or competition, but through consistent quality and reputation. Opportunities that would have seemed intimidating before now felt like extensions of my growth, the acknowledgement of my skill, perseverance, and resilience. I began to see the narrative of my life as one where agency mattered more than reaction, where the ability to craft the story around me was as important as the story itself. Perhaps the most vivid marker of resolution came one winter morning in December 2023. I was walking along the East River, fog rolling in over the water, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. I didn't even recognize the sensation at first, a sense of complete detachment from the emotional baggage I had carried for years. No anger, no longing, no bitterness, no desire for vengeance. Just a calm, profound acknowledgement that I had survived, and not only survived, but transformed. It was in that moment that I understood the truth. Leaving her, disappearing overnight, reclaiming what was mine, and allowing life to unfold without her interference had not been acts of escape or revenge. They were acts of self-preservation, yes, but also acts of reclamation, reclaiming my identity, my power, and my ability to define happiness on my terms. And in that reclamation, I discovered something unexpected. Freedom doesn't come from punishing those who hurt you. Freedom comes from creating a life so rich, so intentional, and so fully your own that the past loses its grip entirely. I didn't need her apology or acknowledgement. I didn't need validation. I didn't even need closure from her. I had found closure in myself. Looking back now, I can see how every decision, every moment of hesitation, every sleepless night, and every step into the unknown contributed to the man I became. I had learned lessons that no amount of advice or self-help book could convey. The importance of self-respect, the necessity of setting boundaries, the power of patience, and the ultimate value of living authentically. By the end of 2023, I was fully immersed in my own narrative. Samantha existed as a memory, a person who had once mattered deeply but no longer had influence over my life. Our shared history was a closed chapter, not erased, not denied, but transformed into a source of strength and clarity. In a way, her absence had taught me more about presence than I could have imagined. It showed me that love could be both a gift and a trap, that betrayal could be a teacher, and that leaving wasn't always a sign of weakness but often a testament to courage. The last significant act of resolution was almost symbolic. I returned to Boston for a short visit, not to confront her or relive old pain, but to retrieve a few personal items I had left behind. Photographs, letters, keepsakes I no longer needed. Walking through the empty apartment, now hers once again, I felt neither nostalgia nor anger. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the experiences, both beautiful and painful, that had shaped me. Gratitude for the strength I had found within myself. Gratitude for the life I had rebuilt from scratch, guided solely by my own choices and convictions. And as I locked the door for the last time, suitcase in hand, I felt the final thread of connection sever. Not in cruelty, not in spite, but in peace. I was free. Standing outside, I looked up at the Boston skyline, its familiar contours now distant and irrelevant. I breathed in the crisp air, tasted the promise of new beginnings, and understood that true resolution isn't dramatic or loud. It is quiet, steady, and internal. It is found in the unwavering knowledge that you have survived, that you have learned, and that you have reclaimed your life in its entirety. On the plane back to New York, I reflected on the journey. From the night I disappeared, to the months of legal and emotional fallout, to the quiet victories of self-reclamation, to the final act of living authentically, every step had been necessary. Every tear, every pang of longing, every moment of doubt had contributed to the life I now fully owned. And for the first time in years, I felt a kind of peace I had thought impossible. A peace born not from revenge, not from validation, not from external acknowledgement, but from the unshakable certainty that I had survived, I had grown, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and entirely in control of my own narrative. I smiled as the city lights of New York came into view. The life I had built was mine, fiercely, unapologetically, and irrevocably. I had disappeared overnight, yes, leaving behind the life that had been poisoned by betrayal. But in doing so, I hadn't just left. I had transformed, reclaimed, and created something enduring. And in that quiet triumph, I realized the ultimate truth. Some people come into your life and leave scars, but those scars can become the blueprint for strength. I had learned how to disappear, but more importantly, I had learned how to reappear, whole, unstoppable, and free. The past no longer had a hold over me. The future, uncertain and unwritten, was mine to shape. And finally, I was ready.